The Marine stood there, grimy and exhausted beyond measure, barely registering the words their officer shouted above the din of distant artillery. He was asking them to charge once more, to climb yet another unremarkable hill that blocked their path forward, another pile of rock and earth concealing an enemy determined to stop their advance at any cost. But something in his voice cut through their weariness, stirring emotions they thought had died somewhere back in the mud and blood of previous battles. His words rang out with unmistakable clarity and purpose. When they went up that hill, some of them would never come back down. They all understood the hell that awaited them at the summit, but the hill had to be taken, and they would be the ones to do it. He was going to the top of Sugar Loaf Hill, and he wanted to know who would come with him. With that simple challenge, Major Henry Courtney Jr. led 44 Marines in a desperate charge that would forever link the name Sugar Loaf with courage, savagery, death, and extraordinary gallantry in the annals of Marine Corps history. The campaign for Okinawa had begun 6 weeks earlier in a manner that starkly contradicted the violence that Courtney's unit would soon experience. Marine Colonel Earl Landreth, observing the assault Marines during their landing on April 1, 1945, could scarcely believe the absence of enemy resistance. He sat in his landing craft, meticulously recording observations in his small black notebook as the vessel pushed toward shore, marveling at how the enemy mortar shells and machine gun fire he had anticipated never materialized. The placid waters remained undisturbed, free from the cauldron of death he had expected. Only an eerie quiet greeted Landreth and his fellow Marines as they approached the beach. Military planners had selected the landing site along Okinawa's western coastline near Hagushi village because the broad beaches and gentle surf provided an ideal entry point, and because the gradually ascending terrain beyond opened toward two crucial airfields situated just 1 mile inland. The Marines had steeled themselves for a horrific reception at the shoreline, something akin to the nightmarish carnage at Tarawa 17 months earlier, where they would have to claw their way forward inch by bloody inch just to reach the sand. At Ulithi, a briefing officer had delivered the grim truth to a group of privates and corporals from the 1st Marine Division. PFC Eugene B. Sledge, who would later pen one of the war's most powerful memoirs, remembered the officer's words to the silent assembly. They should expect this to be the costliest amphibious assault of the entire war. They would be striking an island a mere 350 miles from Japan's home islands, which meant the enemy would fight with unprecedented ferocity. Casualties on the beach could reach 80 to 85%. Sledge and the other young men sat in shocked silence, as though listening to their own death sentences being read aloud. No previous operation had exacted such a terrible price from its initial assault waves, yet they were being told to expect exactly that. To mitigate that horrifying prediction, a massive week-long bombardment of Okinawa commenced on March 24th, delivering more than 27,000 rounds of 5-inch or larger shells onto Japanese positions. The relentless barrage shattered enemy nerves and prevented sleep, prompting one irritated Japanese soldier to write furiously in his diary, demanding to know what kind of bastards would subject them to such punishment. Despite the tremendous pounding, the Japanese sustained relatively light casualties and few of their fortified positions were demolished. The bombardment represented just one component of the enormous force assembling for the campaign, which marked the first time ground forces from Admiral Chester W. Nimitz' Central Pacific Offensive would unite with General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Thrust. Over 180,000 troops comprised the 10th Army, the designated force ordered to capture Okinawa. Army Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner commanded 7 divisions, 4 Army divisions under Major General John Hodge, and 3 Marine divisions, the 1st, 2nd, and 6th, under Major General Roy S. Geyer. The United States sought Okinawa for 3 compelling reasons. First, American medium-range bombers could strike the Japanese home islands from Okinawa, positioned just 360 miles southwest of Kyushu. Second, military planners required the island as a staging base for the scheduled November invasion of Japan itself. Finally, seizing Okinawa would sever the remaining supply routes connecting resource-rich territories in the southwest to resource-starved Japan. Marine and Army infantry units faced formidable opposition from more than 100,000 troops of the 32nd Army, led by their inspiring commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who defied the crude stereotypes about Japanese officers circulating throughout wartime America. Thoughtful, and reserved rather than barbaric and bombastic. Ushijima had built an impressive military career before arriving at Okinawa, commanding infantry in Burma and serving as commandant of the Japanese military academy at Zama. The lean man with the prominent mustache carried himself with the dignity of an ancient samurai warrior. His reputation for courage under fire and his paternal manner inspired not merely confidence but genuine affection among those serving under him. He conversed with young soldiers and thanked volunteers who labored on fortifications, and while he delegated significant responsibilities to his staff, he accepted personal blame whenever operations went awry. Shortly before the Americans stormed ashore, Ushijima offered straightforward counsel to his troops, speaking not as a fiery coach delivering a halftime speech, but as a wise mentor advising his most trusted student. He told them they must understand that material superiority usually prevailed over spiritual strength in modern warfare. The Americans clearly possessed superior weaponry, so they should not rely solely on fighting spirit to overcome the enemy. Instead, they should develop combat methods based on mathematical precision, then apply their spiritual power within that framework. Few strategists, including Ushijima himself, doubted that Okinawa would eventually fall to the Americans. However, if the Japanese could force their adversary into a prolonged, grinding campaign, they might delay the inevitable invasion of the Japanese home islands until peace negotiations succeeded or some miracle saved Japan from total defeat. Ushijima knew his men would contest every yard of territory, for once Okinawa fell, little would remain to keep the United States from Japan's doorstep. He correctly assessed that he could not stop the Americans on Okinawa's beaches or across its relatively flat northern terrain, where American tanks and aircraft could inflict devastating casualties. Instead, he decided to make his stand in the south, where the hilly landscape favored his defensive strategy and where he could exploit the port of Naha, Nakagusuku Bay, the substantial city of Shuri, and important airfields. Ushijima planned to allow American forces to land unopposed and advance inland, then wait until they turned southward. There, on his terms and on ground better suited to his forces, he intended to destroy them. Unlike the flat northern region, ridges, ravines, cliffs, and limestone caves dominated Okinawa's southern third. Stretching along an east-west axis directly across the island, the undulating terrain created a multi-layered complex of natural defensive lines. Hills and 300-foot ridges overlooked dirt roads that wound through valleys, creating perfect killing zones for Ushijima soldiers and artillery when American units advanced along these routes. Ushijima anchored 3 parallel defensive lines on ancient Shuri Castle, which from its commanding hilltop position guarded the approaches to a 6-mile-wide corridor into southern Okinawa. From the castle, the western flank extended through the ridges toward Naha and the sea, while the eastern flank reached toward Yonabaru Airfield near the ocean. Elaborate tunnel networks connected underground chambers, caves, and weapon emplacements. Above ground, Okinawan burial vaults provided Ushijima with countless miniature fortresses from which to oppose the American advance. Ushijima intended to exhaust the Americans by forcing them to assault every ridge and clear every cave and burial vault. Protective trenches bristling with troops armed with machine guns and knee mortars stood before the ridges, while heavy machine gun positions added their devastating fire from the ridges behind. Mortars positioned along the crests and reverse slopes, combined with artillery directed from adjacent hills, would contribute additional destructive force. When units in the first defensive line could no longer hold, Ushijima would withdraw them to a second line, where the Americans would have to repeat the same costly operations to dislodge their enemy once again. Ushijima hoped to separate American infantry from their supporting tanks by directing concentrated artillery fire against the armor, then sending Japanese soldiers with satchel charges and burning rags on suicidal runs toward the tanks. Other infantry would shoot or bayonet American tank crews as they abandoned their burning vehicles. Murderous fire from hundreds of caves and gun emplacements would then annihilate the exposed American infantry. Ushijima positioned 2 elite divisions, 24,000 troops from the 62nd 24th Divisions, along the main defensive line, reinforced by the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, 1 tank regiment, 15,000 naval personnel, and 20,000 members of the WWII, the Okinawan Home Guard. Ushijima could also count on 3,500 men stationed on the Oroku Peninsula under Vice Admiral Minoru Oda, positioned a short distance behind the Shuri line. Okinawa might fall, but at a cost that would make the Americans reconsider future assaults on Japanese-held territory. Marines and Army forces remained unaware of these preparations as they readied themselves to hit the beaches on April 1st. Some commented on the coincidence of attacking on April Fool's Day. Others noted the irony that it was also Easter Sunday, celebrated throughout the Christian world as a day of peace and redemption. In a deafening pre-invasion bombardment, 42 ships and nearly 200 gunboats saturated the area immediately behind Ogushi's beaches with massive shells, while 500 naval aircraft crisscrossed the skies, strafing the landing zones. As that hellish prelude concluded, the 1st and 6th Marines crashed ashore on the northern sections of the beaches, while the Army 7th and 96th Divisions struck the southern portion. Private First Class Eugene Sledge detected a sinister implication in the lack of opposition. If a substantial Japanese force existed on Okinawa, where were they? Sooner or later they would strike back with terrible vengeance. An unopposed landing simply meant brutal fighting would occur somewhere else at some later time. For the moment, though, Marines took comfort in remaining alive. Their fortune continued as units pushed inland toward their initial objectives. Time magazine's Pacific correspondent Robert Sherrod, who had covered the Marine landings at Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, wrote that the scene was hard to believe. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces at Okinawa, jubilantly radioed his superior at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, suggesting that the Japanese appeared to have quit the war, at least in this sector. A more measured Nimitz replied, telling him to delete everything after crazy. By nightfall, 60,000 men with their supporting tanks, artillery, and supplies had established a beachhead 5,000 yards deep and 15,000 yards wide. The smooth advance across Ishikawa Isthmus continued the following day, when elements of the 1st Marine Division reached within sight of Okinawa's eastern coast. Marines secured the coast the next day, severing Ushijima's main force in the south from his troops in northern Okinawa. In 4 days of rapid progress, American forces captured what planners had estimated would require 3 weeks. One relieved infantryman from the 7th Division remarked that he had already lived longer than he thought he would. Encouraged by the campaign's surprising ease, Marines constructed what they considered life's comforts, mess halls, showers, and an outdoor movie screen. General Buckner sent the 1st and 6th Marines northward, while the 3 Army divisions turned south to locate the enemy. Sledge proved prescient, however. Eventually, the Marines' good fortune had to end. One place where it came to a devastating halt was a small mound of earth bearing a deceptively innocent name, Sugar Loaf Hill. While the Marines located and engaged the enemy on the Motobu Peninsula in the north, their Army counterparts stalled before the first of Ushijima's 3 defensive lines in the Shuri region. Once the Marines completed their northern mission, Buckner brought them south to help breach the Shuri line. The 6th Marine Division entered the lines against Ushijima's western seaward flank, while the 1st relieved the exhausted Army 27th Infantry Division on the eastern flank. Buckner had divided the island into 2 combat zones, with Marines covering the western half and the Army the eastern half. 2 formidable adversaries now stood opposite each other, about to embark on a costly campaign fought across Okinawa's rugged ridges. As Marines moved into position along the Shuri line, Japanese commanders debated their next move. A catastrophic Japanese counterattack on May 3rd forced Ushijima to withdraw his forces to the second of his defensive lines, an 8-mile path winding from Yonabaru on the east coast, through treacherous ridges near Shuri Castle, into the port of Naha on Okinawa's western coast. The terrain along this line bore misleading names that sounded more like amusement park attractions than battlefields. Chocolate Drop Hill, Zebra Hill, Sugar Hill, Ward Hill, and Sugar Loaf Hill dominated Ushijima's second line, but their rugged features, concealing hundreds of Japanese machine guns and mortars, soon tested Marine and Army courage and transformed these childlike names into words synonymous with death, suffering, and terror. Buckner planned to throw 85,000 men in 5 divisions against this line, partly responding to Nimitz's urgent request to accelerate the ground operation so his ships could depart the dangerous waters off Okinawa, while the 96th Infantry Division attempted to swing around Ushijima's eastern flank at Yonabaru, and the 6th Marine Division drove toward Naha. The Army's 77th Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division would advance through the center toward Shuri Castle. If units turned either flank, They had orders to race across Okinawa and trap Ushijima's forces. When Buckner's general offensive began at 7 o'clock in the morning on May 11th, the 3rd Battalion captured high ground near the Osato River that commanded a view of Naha. Delaying an advance against the town temporarily, Marines swung south and east toward hilly terrain between Naha and Shuri, hoping to encircle Ushijima's defensive system. The astute Japanese commander had anticipated such a maneuver and positioned a surprise directly in the path of the 6th Marine Division, the fortifications at Sugar Loaf Hill. Many 6th Division Marines approaching Sugar Loaf wondered how something so ordinary-looking could possibly cause serious problems. Shuri Heights, rising dramatically just a few hundred yards behind them, appeared to dwarf what most Marines dismissed as a minor obstacle. A brief action, at most, might be required before the division closed in on Ushijima's central strongpoint at Shuri Castle. The clay elevation hardly inspired fear. Sparsely dotted with shrubs and trees, Sugar Loaf's 300 yards of frontage rose to only about 75 feet before leveling off into a narrow crest. However, beneath its tranquil exterior, 2,000 Japanese defenders waited patiently to deliver lethal blows with hundreds of machine guns, mortars, grenades, and satchel charges, for the modest hill anchored the western end of Ushijima's main defensive line and stood as guardian to both Naha and Shuri. Combined with Horseshoe Hill to its south and Half Moon Hill to its southeast, Sugar Loaf formed the point of a deadly arrow thrust from Shuri directly at the approaching Marines, who would be forced to advance across level terrain before even setting foot on one of the slopes. Ushijima, who intended to stop his enemy on the flat ground and the slopes, manned the trio of hills with fresh defenders from the 15th Independent Regiment of the 44th Brigade, led by Colonel Sekomida, and transformed the elevations into intricate, tunneled complexes bristling with machine guns and mortar nests. The Japanese commander had so carefully designed his defenses that should American forces attack any single point, artillery from Shuri Heights and converging fire from all 3 hills would tear into their ranks. Every foot of Sugar Loaf had been mapped and targeted. Every possible approach was covered. At the first sign of the enemy, the dormant hill would explode to life with devastating gunfire that would annihilate unsuspecting platoons and companies. Sugar Loaf quickly stamped its deadly mark on the combatants. A week-long pattern of struggle left Marines exhausted and stunned. Through withering gunfire that depleted their ranks with each step, Marines advanced up the hill slopes or even rushed to Sugar Loaf's crest, only to fall back before ferocious opposition. 50 men might reach the incline. 15 would scramble back, bloodied and dazed. Company G of the 22nd Regiment's 2nd Battalion, commanded by Captain Owen T. Stebbins, initiated 7 days of agony with an infantry tank assault on the afternoon of May 12th. Confident that a quick operation lay ahead, Company G encountered minimal gunfire in their first 900 yards. Suddenly, chaos erupted as small arms fire, machine guns, mortars, and artillery ripped into their ranks and pinned down 2 of the 3 platoons before reaching Sugar Loaf slopes. Captain Stebbins and Lieutenant Dale W. Bair led 40 men from the remaining platoon toward the hill. But before they advanced 100 yards, 28 Marines fell to Japanese gunfire. Stebbins collapsed when machine gun bullets tore through his legs. Bair assumed command, but before he could issue his first order, Japanese bullets shredded his left arm. With the limb hanging useless, Bair gathered 25 Marines and, after grabbing a light machine gun with his good hand, resumed the attack. Upon reaching Sugar Loaf's crest with 10 men, the 6-foot, 2-inch-tall, 225-pound officer boldly stood atop the hill and sprayed the enemy with machine gun fire. Bair's complete disregard for danger inspired his men. One Marine stated that it was impossible to be afraid when watching him stand there. Sergeant Edmund DeMar claimed Bair looked like a Hollywood actor in those popular war movies where a solitary soldier fires courageously at a swarm of enemies, remarking on what a sight he was, standing there alone at the top of Sugar Loaf. 2 more bullets struck Bair before he fell. One tore a chunk of flesh from his leg, and the other ripped away a portion of his buttocks. DeMar, bleeding profusely from a thigh wound, saw nothing but dead or wounded Marines surrounding him. Amid the carnage and noise, one sound haunted DeMar, a young Marine, wounded and terrified, crying for his mother and father. The dwindling number of survivors on the scorching summit realized they had to abandon Sugar Loaf to avoid complete annihilation. Under cover of a protective smokescreen, Marines began crawling down the slopes toward their lines. Imar, who labeled the situation on Sugar Loaf a complete mess, told another Marine concerned about his wounds that he would crawl all the way to Madison, Connecticut, if necessary. After a short distance, a tank driver lifted Dimar onto the top of his vehicle and applied a bandage to the wound. But he too fell to enemy gunfire and slumped unconscious beside Dimar. As the tank moved cautiously down the hostile, smoke-covered slopes, the injured driver's blood trickled onto Dimar. He later declared what a ride it was, covered with blood from both his leg wound and the tremendous amount from the tanker, noting they must have looked like something from a horror movie. Company G repeatedly stormed Sugar Loaf throughout May 12th, even seizing its summit on 3 occasions, but each time Japanese mortars and hand grenades drove them back. When nightfall arrived, the hill remained in Japanese hands, while Marines tended their wounded. Dimar's platoon suffered 50% casualties, while only 75 of 215 men in Company G were able to man their posts that night. The most demoralizing aspect was that, despite the appalling losses, Marines faced further attempts in the coming days. Sugar Loaf had to be taken, which meant more young Americans would die. Marines repeated the gruesome pattern over the next 6 days. Elements of the 22nd Regiment again reached Sugar Loaf summit on May 13th, but artillery fire from Shuri heights and powerful Japanese counterattacks again drove them off. Both the 22nd and 29th Regiments attacked the hill the next day. 2 companies of Marines gained the summit by early afternoon, but heavy flanking fire forced them back down. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Horatio C. Woodhouse, Jr., ordered a late afternoon assault that stalled on Sugar Loaf slopes and stranded 44 Marines amid punishing fire that killed or wounded more than 100 fellow Marines. As Japanese soldiers rolled hand grenades from Sugar Loaf summit down onto the Marines below, Major Henry Courtney Jr., the 2nd Battalion's executive officer, rallied the small group of attackers with stirring words and bold example. Angry about being caught on Sugar Loaf slope, Courtney figured he and his men found themselves in one of those desperate combat situations where, since they were too weak to defend their position, they might as well attack. Courtney began by telling his men that if they did not take the hilltop that night, the Japanese would come down in the morning to drive them away. He explained that when they reached the summit, he wanted every man to throw as many hand grenades as possible to suppress the enemy, then dig in for a long stay. After calling for mortar support, Courtney asked for volunteers to accompany him. Courtney started up with 44 Marines, hurling grenades into caves as he rushed past. Once at the top, Courtney's group dug in for what they knew would be a bloody nighttime battle for control of Sugar Loaf. Enemy soldiers, hidden by darkness, crawled so close to Courtney's crude perimeter that Marines could hear the Japanese grunt as they threw grenades upward. Around midnight, Courtney detected movement on the Japanese-controlled side that alerted him to a possible banzai charge. Before the enemy could attack, Courtney hastily organized his men and launched a quick preemptive strike over Sugar Loaf's crest. The dangerous move, possibly considered foolhardy in calmer circumstances and safer environments, became typical on Sugar Loaf, where men took risks they normally would never consider. One Marine who witnessed the attack later said that Courtney might have gone a little crazy, but that happens when you spend what seems like an eternity trying to take a place like Sugar Loaf, watching so many friends getting shot up so badly. Then you think to hell with it and do something you would not normally do. As Courtney and his ragged band drove the Japanese back, a hand grenade exploded near Courtney, inflicting a fatal neck wound on the brave leader. Marines, devastated by the loss of their commander, covered Courtney's body with a poncho and continued battling to hold their position. But as the long night wore on, mortars and sniper fire reduced the number of able Marines to 15. Tragically, the next morning they once again yielded Sugar Loaf's crest. A Japanese counterattack at 7:30 in the morning on May 15th forced the few remaining Marines off Sugar Loaf and crashed into Marine lines at the hill's base, where the battered 2nd Battalion fought desperately to halt the attack. 6 hours of hand-to-hand combat produced valiant scenes. Wounded Corporal John A. Spazzafero maintained his fire until he killed the Japanese soldier who shot him, then collapsed a short distance from his injured platoon leader, Lieutenant Edgar C. Green. The two, out of contact with the rest of the Marines, lay as motionless as possible to deceive the Japanese swarming around them. With eyes shut tight and hearts pounding, they heard 4 enemy soldiers approach. One stepped toward Green, removed his wristwatch, then reached into Green's jacket pocket searching for valuables. The Japanese quickly yanked his hand back when he felt a sticky substance, Green's blood, and rushed away to clean it up. Green and Spotsafaro lay still for an entire day in Japanese-held territory until the Marine line reached them again, and they could be evacuated. The brutal fighting shocked even veteran Marines. Private Dean Klingenhagen, pinned down by heavy mortar and machine gun fire, heard a muffled explosion behind him. He turned to see the blackened, almost unrecognizable body of his platoon leader, who had been struck directly by a mortar shell. Moments later, another Marine, moaning in pain, crawled past Klingenhagen with his right foot blown off. The Americans battled for 10 hours to halt the Japanese counterattack. Marines threw so many hand grenades at the enemy that part of the terrain where they fought was labeled Hand Grenade Ridge. Corporal Jack Castagnola worked with machine-like precision, pulling the pin from one grenade and rolling it down on the enemy while reaching for another. Castagnola, a future high school state champion football coach, also shot and killed a huge enemy soldier who would have made a good football end. Over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 200 pounds, the Japanese soldier walked near Marine lines dressed in a Marine uniform to disguise his identity. At first, Castagnola paid little attention, but then he noticed the man's long rifle and unusual helmet, telltale signs of a Japanese soldier. He recalled that the man sagged like a loose rope the first time he shot him. In 3 days of fighting, the 22nd Regiment suffered a 60% casualty rate. Its 2nd Battalion alone lost more than 400 men, requiring superiors to replace it with the 3rd Battalion. Despite the carnage, the Marines held their positions through thunderous artillery and mortar fire the night of May 15th-16. The Marines renewed their assault on Sugar Loaf at 8:30 in the morning on May 16th, the 5th consecutive day of ebb and flow combat. While the 29th Regiment climbed partially up Half Moon, the 22nd focused on Sugar Loaf. Supported by covering fire from the 29th, a battalion of Marines edged around Sugar Loaf's left side late in the afternoon hoping to dash up the slopes, but ran into devastating enemy fire, including artillery from Shuri heights that pounded their left flank and rear. 4 separate times Marines rushed up to gain Sugar Loaf's summit. 4 separate times they withdrew. Combat correspondent Elvis Lane viewed the carnage at Sugar Loaf and wrote about corpses littering the gray, muddy landscape. Numerous severed arms and legs lay scattered about, along with an occasional head. He wondered how many besides himself were trying not to look at the dead. Some of the corpses seemed to be grinning, as the flesh had rotted away from the skull and the teeth were exposed. He feared that if he stared, one of these grinning dead might ask if he belonged with them, and another might make the monstrous prediction that the war was not over and he would soon be joining them. The macabre drill up the slopes, back down the slopes, more Marine dead littering the ground, continued the next morning, but this time a noticeable crack finally appeared in Ushijima's defenses. After an effective combination of heavy battleship bombardment followed by carrier-based airstrikes, 6th Division Commander Major General Lemuel C. Shepard moved the 29th Regiment through a small depression running east of Sugar Loaf. Once safely through, the regiment split into 2 forces and attacked Sugar Loaf and Half Moon. One company rushed Sugar Loaf's eastern slope and reached the top, but another fierce counterattack toppled the Marines back down the slope. The company commander, Captain Alan Meissner, ordered his men to fix bayonets and led them to the top again. But he also had to pull back facing savage hand-to-hand fighting. After a 3rd attempt failed, frustrated Marines finally reached the summit late in the afternoon and successfully repelled a counterattack. They dug in to hold the crest, but in a cruel twist of fate the Marines ran out of ammunition. After suffering 160 casualties, the Marines had to again yield the crest. On the positive side, a battalion seized a large section of Half Moon Hill, which meant Marines could count on increased fire support for the next day's attempt. General Shepard saw an opportunity to conclude the nasty business at Sugar Loaf. An elaborate ruse worked to perfection on May 18th. The commander of D Company, 29th Regiment, Captain Howard L. Mabby, sent a group of Marines against Half Moon and Horseshoe to divert enemy machine gun and mortar fire away from Sugar Loaf. While the Japanese turned their weapons on this group, A second force of Marines, backed by tanks, hit Sugar Loaf's right flank. As the Japanese defenders shifted men to that sector, Mabe dispatched a third group of men and tanks around the left flank to Sugar Loaf's rear, then sent 80 men under 1st Lieutenant Francis X. Smith up the forward slope. When Smith and his men reached the summit, they tossed grenades on the Japanese from above, while Mabe's tanks fired point-blank from below. Ushijima's defenders had no choice but to either abandon their positions through near-suicidal retreats through the Marines or rush the Americans with banzai efforts. One group streaked out of a cave with explosives strapped to their backs, but quickly disappeared in a violent explosion when Marine machine gun bullets ignited the satchel charges. While this occurred, Marines gunned down fleeing Japanese with abandon. Lieutenant Donald R. Pinno watched as the Japanese began running down from the crest, estimating there must have been 150 of them. His unit fired and blew them across the landscape. Those actions ended the fight for Sugar Loaf, which finally fell silent after so many days of chaos. Weary Marines maintained a tight vigil, but after 7 maddening days the scarred, churned elevation was theirs, fighting for what had initially appeared to be a harmless accumulation of dirt and rock. 6th Division Marines suffered 2,662 men killed or wounded. They lost another 1,289 men evacuated because of either exhaustion or battle fatigue. Although Ushijima continued to harass the Marines until both Horseshoe and Half Moon Hills were secured, Marines never again relinquished their hold on Sugar Loaf. Correspondent Lane's reaction typified how privates and captains, corporals and majors felt now that they had survived the week-long bloodbath. Lane thought the fighting on Sugar Loaf must be the bloodiest triumph in Corps history. He thanked God there were no signs whatsoever that the enemy was again rushing troops to try and recapture this hill. He had lost count of how many times Sugar Loaf was seized by the Japanese, and how many days they had been there. The silence convinced them that Sugar Loaf really belonged to the 29th Regiment.